Picture this. You're standing in the shadows of the Great Palace of Constantinople, watching through silk curtains as the most powerful woman in the Byzantine Empire performs a ritual so disturbing that chroniclers refuse to record its full details. The year is 797 AD, and Empress Irene has just ordered the brutal blinding of her own son to maintain her grip on power. But what you're witnessing now isn't political maneuvering. It's something far more twisted, something that reveals the dark underbelly of imperial femininity in a world where women wielded absolute authority behind marble walls and golden doors. The air is thick with incense and something else you can't identify, something that makes your skin crawl. You hear chanting in languages that predate Christianity, mixed with prayers to saints whose names have been forgotten by history. The Empress moves through the chamber with practiced precision, her purple robes trailing behind her like spilled blood. This isn't the sanitized version of Byzantine history taught in universities, where empresses are portrayed as pious patrons of art and religion. This is the reality that lived in the spaces between official chronicles, a world where power, sexuality, and spirituality twisted together into practices that would shock even the most jaded modern observer. Before diving into these forgotten stories of imperial excess and religious corruption, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the darker chapters of human civilization. The Byzantine Empire lasted over 1,000 years, and during that time, dozens of women wielded power as empresses, regents, and imperial mothers. While male emperors are remembered for their military campaigns and theological disputes, the empress lived in a different world entirely. One where influence flowed through bedchambers and private chapels, where ancient pagan traditions survived beneath layers of Christian orthodoxy, and where the line between sacred ritual and sexual perversion became impossibly blurred. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of medieval decadence. These are accounts of systematic practices that were woven into the very fabric of imperial court life. Rituals that were passed down from empress to empress like a dark inheritance that no one dared to refuse. The sources for these stories come from palace insiders, monks who served as confessors to the imperial family, and foreign ambassadors who witnessed ceremonies they were never meant to see. Let's begin with the woman who set the template for imperial female power, Theodora, wife of Emperor Justinian. History remembers her as a former actress who rose from humble origins to become one of the most influential empresses in Byzantine history. But the sanitized accounts leave out the most disturbing aspects of her transformation from entertainer to empress, and more importantly, the rituals she established that would corrupt imperial women for centuries to come. Theodora's background in the entertainment industry of 6th century Constantinople wasn't simply about acting in theatrical productions. The theatres of the time were centres of sexual commerce where performers were expected to provide services that went far beyond dramatic interpretation. Theodora had spent years perfecting arts that had nothing to do with legitimate performance, developing skills that would later serve her in ways that chroniclers found too shocking to describe in detail. But it wasn't just her past that made Theodora dangerous. It was what she did with the power she gained as empress. Palace sources describe elaborate ceremonies conducted in the private chambers of the imperial women. Rituals that combined elements of ancient fertility cults with corrupted Christian symbolism. These weren't casual indulgences or moments of personal weakness. They were systematic practices that served specific political and spiritual purposes. The most detailed account comes from a monk named Evagrius, who served as a confessor to several imperial women during the 7th century. His private writings, discovered centuries later in a monastery library, describe ceremonies that he witnessed while administering last rites to dying court officials. What he saw in those private chambers challenged everything he believed about Christian virtue and imperial authority. According to Evagrius, The empress would gather her closest female attendants, women who had been carefully selected not for their noble birth or political connections, but for their willingness to participate in practices that violated both Christian doctrine and basic human decency. These gatherings took place in chambers deep within the palace complex, rooms that had been specially prepared with symbols and artifacts that combined Christian iconography with far older religious traditions. The centerpiece of these rituals was an altar that had been blessed by Orthodox priests, but decorated with objects that told a very different story. Ancient fertility symbols were worked into the metalwork, while the altar cloth bore embroidered scenes that appeared to depict biblical stories, but actually portrayed narratives from pre-Christian mystery religions. This careful blending of sacred and profane allowed the participants to maintain the fiction that their activities were somehow compatible with Christian orthodoxy. But the physical setting was just the beginning. The rituals themselves were designed to break down the barriers between participants, creating bonds of shared transgression that ensured absolute loyalty to the empress. New members of the court were initiated through ceremonies that began with seemingly innocent prayers and gradually escalated into activities that compromised them completely. Once a woman had participated, she was bound to the empress not just by political necessity, but by the knowledge that exposure would mean spiritual damnation and social destruction. The psychological impact of these rituals extended far beyond the immediate participants. The empress used knowledge of who had participated and in what ways as leverage throughout the imperial court. Husbands could be controlled through threats to expose their wives' activities. Ambitious courtiers found their advancement dependent not on merit or political skill, but on their willingness to offer their female relatives as participants in the empress's ceremonies. Perhaps most disturbing was how these practices were justified by their participants. Rather than acknowledging the obvious contradictions between their behavior and Christian teaching, the empresses developed elaborate theological justifications that portrayed their activities as advanced forms of spiritual devotion. They claimed to be following mystical traditions that had been revealed to them through divine visions, practicing forms of worship that were too sophisticated for ordinary believers to understand. This theological sophistication allowed the rituals to evolve and become more elaborate over time. Each empress added her own innovations, drawing from different sources of ancient knowledge and developing new ceremonies that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior even further. What had begun as relatively simple fertility rituals gradually became complex performances that incorporated elements from across the known world: Egyptian mystery traditions, Persian fire worship, Celtic earth magic, and corrupted forms of Christian mysticism. The foreign ambassadors who occasionally witnessed these ceremonies struggled to understand what they were seeing. A Frankish diplomat writing in the 9th century described attending what he thought was a religious service in honor of the Virgin Mary, only to realize that the prayers being offered bore no resemblance to any Christian liturgy he recognized. The women participating moved through choreographed sequences that seemed to tell a story, but the narrative being enacted had nothing to do with biblical history or orthodox Christian doctrine. What made these accounts particularly credible was their consistency across different time periods and sources. Palace servants, foreign visitors, and church officials all described similar elements: the careful preparation of sacred spaces, the gradual escalation from prayer to more extreme activities, the psychological techniques used to ensure participation and silence, and the elaborate justifications that allowed participants to maintain their public images as pious Christian women. The most chilling aspect of these reports wasn't the specific acts being performed, but the systematic nature of the corruption they revealed. This wasn't random debauchery or individual moral failure. It was an institutional practice that had been refined over generations, passed down from one empress to the next, like a dark inheritance that shaped the very nature of imperial power. The rituals created a shadow court within the official imperial hierarchy, a network of women bound together by shared transgression and mutual dependence. Political decisions that seemed to make no sense from the outside often became clear when viewed through the lens of these hidden relationships and obligations. The corruption spread through imperial families like a contagion, affecting not just the empresses themselves, but their daughters, sisters, and female relatives who were drawn into the web of ritual obligation. Young women who entered the imperial court as innocent brides or political hostages found themselves gradually inducted into practices that would have horrified their families back home. The process was carefully orchestrated, beginning with seemingly harmless ceremonies that honored traditional feminine virtues and slowly progressing to activities that crossed every moral boundary. A particularly disturbing account comes from the court of Empress Zoe in the 11th century. Zoe had married 3 different emperors during her lifetime, and court observers noted that each marriage was preceded by elaborate private ceremonies that seemed to guarantee her husband's devotion, at least temporarily. Michael Sellos, a court historian who had access to imperial records, wrote cryptically about sacred preparations that Zoe underwent before each wedding, rituals that involved offerings to powers older than Christ himself. What made these accounts so unsettling was how they revealed the systematic nature of imperial female networking. The empresses weren't acting alone or in isolation. They were part of a continuous tradition that stretched back centuries, each generation teaching the next how to maintain power through methods that official history would never acknowledge. Young women entering the court were carefully evaluated not just for their political connections or physical beauty, but for their psychological suitability for initiation into these hidden practices. The selection process itself was a form of corruption. Potential participants were observed over months or even years, their reactions to increasingly suggestive conversations and situations carefully noted. Those who showed appropriate flexibility in their moral boundaries were gradually introduced to more explicit discussions about the special responsibilities of imperial women. The empress and her inner circle would share carefully edited stories about historical precedents, making their practices seem like natural extensions of ancient traditions rather than personal perversions. Once a woman had been identified as suitable, the actual initiation process could take months. It began with private prayer sessions where traditional Christian liturgy was gradually modified with subtle alterations. A word changed here, a gesture modified there, until the participants were unknowingly reciting prayers that invoked very different powers than those they believed they were addressing. The chambers where these sessions took place were decorated with artwork that appeared orthodox at first glance, but contained hidden symbols that told a completely different story to those who knew how to read them. The psychological manipulation involved was sophisticated beyond anything we might expect from medieval times. The empresses understood that complete corruption required the willing participation of their victims, not just coerced compliance. They created environments where transgression felt like spiritual advancement, where participation in increasingly extreme activities was framed as evidence of special divine favor and superior understanding of religious mysteries. Foreign queens who married into the Byzantine imperial family were particularly vulnerable to this systematic corruption. Arriving in Constantinople, already isolated from their familiar support systems, they found themselves dependent on the empress and her circle for guidance in navigating the complex world of imperial court life. What seemed like generous mentorship gradually revealed itself as something far more sinister, as these foreign women discovered that acceptance in their new home required participation in practices that would have been unthinkable in their countries of origin. The most detailed account of this process comes from Anna Komnenos, daughter of Emperor Alexios, whose secret writings were discovered in the 20th century, hidden in the walls of a monastery. Anna describes watching her mother, Irina Dalkina, undergo a transformation after her marriage to Alexios, gradually adopting practices that Anna initially dismissed as harmless court customs, but later recognized as something far more disturbing. According to Anna's account, her mother was introduced to these practices through what appeared to be traditional women's religious observances, prayer circles, where imperial women gathered to seek divine guidance for their families and the empire. But Anna noticed that her mother returned from these sessions changed in subtle ways, more confident, but also more secretive, speaking in references that Anna didn't understand, and displaying knowledge of subjects that seemed inappropriate for a Christian empress. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. It unfolded over months as Irene was gradually drawn deeper into the empress's inner circle. Anna describes her mother beginning to collect unusual objects, small sculptures and jewelry that appeared to be Christian religious items, but incorporated symbols that Anna couldn't identify. Irene also began receiving visitors at unusual hours, women who would arrive after dark and leave before dawn, their faces hidden by veils, and their identities never revealed to the imperial family. What made Anna's account particularly credible was her detailed description of the physical changes in the palace itself. Certain chambers that had previously been used for routine court functions were gradually modified with new decorations and furnishings. Walls were repainted with frescoes that seemed to depict traditional Christian scenes, but incorporated elements that created an entirely different narrative for those who understood their true meaning. Altars were modified with new metalwork that appeared to be simple, decorative improvements, but actually changed the spiritual character of the spaces where they were installed. The empress's personal chambers became the center of this hidden network, transformed into spaces where the boundaries between sacred and profane dissolved completely. Anna describes overhearing conversations that suggested her mother and the other court women believed they were practicing an advanced form of Christianity that had been revealed to them through mystical experiences. But the prayers and ceremonies Anna witnessed bore no resemblance to any Orthodox Christian tradition. The financial records from various imperial courts provide another layer of evidence for these practices. Empresses consistently made large expenditures for items that seemed to have no legitimate purpose. Precious metals that weren't turned into conventional jewelry, exotic spices and oils that weren't used in court cuisine, books and manuscripts that were never added to the official imperial library. These purchases suggest systematic preparation for activities that required specialized materials and knowledge. Perhaps most telling were the architectural modifications that empresses regularly made to their private quarters. Construction records show that virtually every empress undertook extensive renovations to create new chambers with unusual specifications, rooms with no windows, elaborate ventilation systems, acoustic properties that would prevent sound from carrying to adjacent areas, and hidden passages that allowed for discreet entry and exit. These weren't random home improvements, but careful preparations for activities that required absolute privacy and security. The corrupting influence of these practices extended beyond the immediate participants to affect the entire structure of imperial governance. Political decisions that seemed irrational or self-destructive often made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of obligations and relationships created through ritual participation. Alliances were formed and broken based on shared involvement in ceremonies rather than legitimate political considerations. Military campaigns were launched or abandoned based on insights allegedly received through mystical practices rather than strategic analysis. The most disturbing aspect was how these practices created a parallel system of authority that operated alongside but separate from the official imperial hierarchy. While emperors believed they were making autonomous decisions about policy and governance, their wives and female relatives were actually coordinating through channels that remained completely hidden from official oversight. The true power structure of the Byzantine Empire included networks of influence that never appeared in any official records, but shaped the course of history in ways that remain largely unrecognized even today. The corruption reached its peak during the reign of Empress Eudokia Makrembolitissa in the 11th century. Unlike her predecessors who had maintained at least the pretense of Christian orthodoxy, Eudokia abandoned all attempts at theological justification for her practices. Palace records from this period, discovered in the archives of the Patriarchate, describe ceremonies that had evolved into something that defied classification as either religious ritual or political theatre. Eudokia's innovations centered around what she called the sacred marriage, a ceremony that ostensibly celebrated the union between the earthly empire and divine authority, but actually served as a vehicle for practices that horrified even the most jaded court observers. The ritual required the participation of newly married women from noble families, who were told they were being honored with a special blessing that would ensure the fertility and prosperity of their households. The ceremony began in the imperial chapel with what appeared to be traditional Christian prayers for married couples. But as the evening progressed, the participants were led through a series of chambers, each decorated more elaborately than the last, until they reached a final room that had been prepared in ways that left no doubt about the true nature of the proceedings. Ancient fertility symbols dominated the decor, while the air was heavy with substances that affected judgment and inhibited resistance. What made Eudokia's practices particularly insidious was how she used the ceremony to create a network of compromised noble families throughout the empire. Once a woman had participated, her husband's political future became dependent on maintaining the empress's favor. This system allowed Eudokia to exercise control over imperial appointments, military commands, and economic policies through methods that remained completely invisible to outside observers. The marble halls of Constantinople have long since fallen silent, but the shadows of these forgotten rituals still haunt our understanding of power itself. These weren't mere historical curiosities. They were systematic networks of corruption that shaped an empire for centuries. The next time you read about the glorious achievements of Byzantine civilization, remember the price that was paid behind those golden doors, and ask yourself what shadows might be hiding behind the powerful institutions of our own time.